So we're delighted to welcome Michael Sells, who's an old friend of the Society and has spoken in the UK and also in the United States many times over many years, so a very old friend. And also we're delighted that he managed to arrive because he's been teaching Islamic civilization in Granada for the last few weeks and came back through France where there were train strikes. But thank God he managed to find a flight from Caen to Southend and is here with us today. So I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Michael because I'll try and keep it brief. There are so many things one could say because he's had such a long and illustrious career. But he's presently the John Henry Barrows Professor of Islamic History and Literature at the Divinity School, University of Chicago, where he also works in the Department of Comparative Literature. He studies and teaches in the areas of Quranic studies, Sufism, Arabic and Islamic love poetry, mystical literature, Greek, Islamic, Christian and Jewish. And he also has done some work on religion and violence. His work on the Quran includes approaching the Quran, the early revelations, which I have heard personal accounts from people has been life-changing for them. And he also co-edited and contributed to the Quranic Studies Today. He's published 3 volumes of Arabic poetry, Desert Tracings, 6 classic Arabian odes, the Cambridge History of Arabic Literature, Al-Andalus, which he co-edited and to which he contributed, and Stations of Desire. The Stations of Desire, which some of you may be familiar with, contains the first translations of Ibn Arabi's Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, or Translator of Desires, into modern poetic English. And this volume also contains some of Michael's own poems, very much modelled on the Tarjuman. His books on mysticism include Early Islamic Mysticism, translations and commentaries on influential mystical passages from Quran, Hadith, Arabic poetry and early Sufi writings, and the wonderful mystical languages of unsaying, the apophatic tradition, with special attention to Plotinus, John the Scot, Ibn Arabi, Meister Eckhart and Marguerite Porete, which has introduced many people to this wonderful world of mysticism and the languages of unsaying. He's also done many studies and books on religion and violence, which I won't mention all of them, but in particular, The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia, the New Crusades, Constructing the Muslim Enemy, and various others. So, Michael has written at the end of his introduction to Stations of Desire, as high literature, the poems of the Tarjuman embrace and bring to life centuries of classical Arabic poetic tradition. As love lyrics, they are also as straight to the heart as a song played on a street corner. So Michael always has something interesting to say, and we're looking forward to your talk today, Michael.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful pleasure to be here. I feel blessed to be here with all these wonderful friends that I've known for so many years, and all the new friends that I'm meeting today. I want to thank Cecilia for your thoughtful introduction, and I want to thank everyone in the Ibn Arabi Society for the extraordinary community that they've worked to build, and they have built over these years. The continual development of the journal, the symposia, which are magnificently coordinated and arranged. The ones in California, the ones here, the ones in New York, and much of my work has stations that pass through these symposia. And the history of my efforts to translate Ibn Arabi's Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. I first brought them out and read the first versions in public at symposium meetings of the Society, and have been working on that ever since. I wanted to start out, before I go into the talk, with a few words in the Arabic of Tarjuman al-Ashwaq from the very first very short poem, and then I'll read it in the translation. And then my plan would be to start then with a larger poem that shows the process of translation, the kind of questions that I've been having, that the issues of translating in different places with different editors, with different venues, trying to reach certain audiences, the choices that we have to make about how to compensate for the rhyme, because in my view, there's no way to make this poetry work with a single end rhyme at the end of every verse, as it is in Arabic. How do we compensate for the meter? Most of these poems are composed in 8 of the classical meters. They're very intricate. To my knowledge, only one British poet, and Wilfred Scaven Blunt, who along with Lady Blunt were 2 of the great intrepid travelers, scholars. They did magnificent travelogues of their journeys to Arabia, and Wilfred Scaven Blunt translated the Mu'allaqat, the 7 most famous pre-Islamic poems, into English versions of the classical meters. It was an extraordinary experiment, and I think quite interesting for us scholars to read. But it has not, when I tried to read it to other audiences, they gave me a look and I stopped. So so then the question is, how do we bring across a poetic form when we have to give up certain of the key features? My view is, how do we compensate for them? What things do we put in place? If we give up the rhyme, how do we develop an acoustics that also attracts the reader without the rhyme? If we give up the meter, how do we develop that intricate dance between tension and release that happens in metered poetry, where sometimes the meter falls right on the syntax, and sometimes it seems to cut right into the syntax, and so you have this sense of tension and release. It's like a dance. And so these are some of the things that I think about. I also will be thinking about, for many years, the Tree of Water, which appeared in Stephen Hertenstein's talk, and I just found it a magnificent image and something to contemplate. I say that as I take a drink. I call this poem The Lords of Love. I wish I knew, if they knew, whose heart they have taken, or my heart knew which high ridge track they follow. Do you picture them safe or perishing? The Lords of Love in love are ensnared, bewildered. ليت شعري هل دروا أي قلب ملك وفؤادي لو درى أي شعب سلكوا أتراهم سلموا أم تراهم هلكوا هار أرباب الهوى في الهوى وارتكبوا. As many of you almost anyone who's familiar with the Tarjuman will know that these three verses, which come at the beginning of the Tarjuman in the groundbreaking work of Reynold Nicholson, 1911, who published the first Arabic printed version of the Tarjuman, along with his own translation and his translation of much of selected parts of Ibn Arabi's own commentary on the Tarjuman. You will know from this book and others that there is a preface that Ibn Arabi gives to the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. And in that preface, he states that he was, one evening, he was circumambulating the Kaaba, and these verses came to his mind. So he backed off of the main paved area of the Kaaba onto the sands at the outer circle so he wouldn't disturb anyone when he voiced these verses. And he said, so I voiced these verses for myself and whoever might have happened to be there and happened to have wished to hear them. And he says that after I voiced these verses, I felt a soft hand on my shoulder, a hand as softer than silk, and I turned around, and there before me was a young lady, a jariya, a maiden, or could also be a slave, and she then proceeds to have a conversation with him along the lines of, "Oh, Master, what was it you were saying just now?" And Ibn Arabi reads that first verse, "Would that I knew," etc. And she says, "Excuse me, I know you're the great master of your time, but isn't it strange for someone like yourself to be saying something like this?" And then she gives this rigorous critique of that verse, then the second verse, then the third verse, and then really just a tour de force critique of the fourth verse, where she basically critiques the poet for not understanding the full power, what real love is. Because at the end, he talks about the lords of love being ensnared and bewildered. And she says, of course, echoing much of the Sufi doctrine of fana, or passing away, the one who is in love is totally gone, sent off with the other martyrs of the past, blown away, obliterated. What is there left of his self to be bewildered? So then Ibn Arabi, who, by the way, throughout his works, makes an extraordinary effort to relate stories of women sheikhs that he studied with, and also women who may be in the realm of imagination, or may have been concrete women who he considered to be masters of ma'arifa, or knowing. this word that's so hard to translate into English because English doesn't have a distinction between knowledge as a more objective thing and knowing as a more experiential sense of coming to know.
Gnosis.
Some people use the word gnosis, and I think it's fine with a small g. A lot of people get hung up on that because they start talking about Gnostics and gnosis with a capital G. So let me go on. Over these past years, I started, let me go back, way back, to when I first encountered the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. I was at the University of Chicago, 1982, finishing my doctorate, where I met my lovely wife, Janet. And I had been studying, up till that time, fairly intensively, two things that really come together in the Tarjuman. One was Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, and that led me to, tied in with my interest in Plotinus and Greek mysticism and other things. That was being taught by Fazl Rahman, who's of Pakistani origin, got his degree in Oxford, went back to Pakistan. There was a controversy we could talk about, maybe the problem of opinion or right that brought that about, but he had to leave Pakistan because people were accusing him of saying something that wasn't proper according to Islamic orthodoxy. He taught in McGill and the University of Chicago. I was also studying pre-Islamic Arabic poetry with a scholar there named Yaroslav Stetkevich, and I was astonished by the depth, the passion, the vividness of the imagery, and the sense of time and space, which seem to flow in different directions, and the sense that the poetic voice was what I call dissembling. It was always saying it was going to describe the beloved, but it never ended up describing the beloved in any practical sense. The way I put it was, if you took all these pre-Islamic beloveds, Maya and Layla and Nawar and Zainab and Ka'ub, and you brought them into the room and you said, which one is Zainab? People have read 1,000 poems. I don't know which one's Zainab, because it gives you the sense of description, but it's really an evocation of water, of paradise, of beautiful times, etc. So at one point I looked into the Tarjuman, and I was really struck by this combination of classical Arabic poetry and some of the possible mystic themes that I'd been reading. Over the years then, began translating these poems. Some appeared in the journal, some appeared in the volume Stations of Desire, others appeared in other venues. And 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, in 2015, here at Oxford, I'd been reading some of these poems, new translations of mine, and Simone Fatal, who is the editor of Post-Apollo Press, and a long and dear friend that I know from these society symposia, said, it would be nice if you ever felt like publishing some poems with me. And I was really thrilled, because that was like something that really would represent some of the experience, a lot of the experience that went into these efforts. So we started that project. It's called Bewildered. The poster for Bewildered I had sent a note to Simone saying, you know, our dear friend Etel Adnan, who's also been with her and in the meetings with me all these years, if she would be kind enough to provide maybe a drawing or something. And she provided this astonishing cover art. All of that is in press. That is, all the proofreading and the edits and the design. And by the way, Simone Fatal and her designer, who's named Minu, really did a beautiful job in choosing fonts, time and space, really locating the poem in a book. All that's been in press for a while. God willing, it will come out in the not too distant future. God willing, and printer schedules willing. So that's probably waiting for the schedule of the printer. About 3 months after I talked to Simone, I received a communication from the editors of the Princeton University Press Lockhart Poetry Series in Translation, proposing that I send them a manuscript of a complete bilingual Arabic, English facing page translation of all the poems in the Futuhat, plus the 2 prefaces, I'll talk about them in a minute, plus some commentary, I'll talk about that in a minute. And ultimately, we agreed to do that. And that is a much more complicated publishing venture. It means, how do you take the Arabic-facing text and line it up with the English text in a way that is visually pleasing and also clear when, as in my case, you're often using couplets, triplets, or for the most part, quatrains to represent each Arabic verse. Because Arabic verses, to really represent a whole Arabic verse in English, you would need a very wide page. The other thing is, I find that by breaking them up into quatrains or couplets, I can use the line breaks to help recreate that tension between tension and release that one finds in meter. Now I'm going to try something I've never done before. In front of the world, I'm going to try to use one of these things. And I think I push this button. I'll try that again. Something happened. Okay, so this is poem 3, and it illustrates some of the challenges, the many challenges involved in this effort. And I wanted to use it as an example of the kind of things that, of course, we all think about when we try to translate anything from one language to another. 2 things in particular. The Tarjuman is chock-filled with place names. There are 66 place names in the Tarjuman. Many of them are repeated numerous times. So I don't know of many examples like this, but there's one passage in Homer's Iliad that goes through all these different places and lists them off. And so how do you bring across place names to people that really, an audience that you can't assume knows where these places are? And more importantly, what these places mean within the poetic tradition. Because when someone says, for example, where's El Kathib, or where is Yalamlam, one could say, well, we think it's on this place on the map in present-day Saudi Arabia, but the question is, there's lots of places in Arabia. why did certain place names take on this thick meaning? And so that when someone in the 13th century uses them, people associate all the accrued meaning with them. So I'll read this in English, and then I'll stop at a couple places that bring up some of the decisions. Turn aside, friends, at El Khatib, past Lalai, and set out for the waters of Yalamlam. There you'll find those you'd come to know. My fast is for them, my pilgrimage, my holy days. May what happened there that day at Pebble Ground near Minna, Oblations Field, at Zamzam, stay with me forever. There, Pebble Ground, my heart. May they cast their pebbles there. Offerings Field, my soul. Their sacred spring, my blood. When you come to Hajar, driver, halt. When you come to Hajar, driver, halt the camels there for a time. Shout forth a greeting and call toward the red pavilions of Hima, a lover's greetings of longing and loss. If the greetings return, bless them and wish them peace. If they are silent, journey on to the river of Isa, where their camels graze and white tents nestle near the mouth of the stream. Sound the names of Dad and Rabab, Fertana and Hind, Lubna and Selma. Then ask them, if there's a girl at Helba who shows you the sun in her smile. So this is a poem that, like many of the poems in the Tarjuman, and also many of the poems of Ibn Arabi's exact contemporary, who is mentioned by Jane Clark, I think, Ibn al-Farid. These are poems that combine the classical Arabic traditions of love poetry, the nasib part of the classical qasida, or the ghazal, which became the word that was used for a self-standing love poem. There were two kinds of ghazals, early ghazals. One you might call the passionate or martyrdom ghazal, associated with Majnun Layla and numerous other figures. The other was what has been called the urbane ghazal, often more playful, sometimes containing a lot of flirtatious language that had a lighter effect, and they're associated with primarily with a poet named Omar ibn Abi Rabia, so I just call him the poet Omar to make clear who he was. It combines that tradition, by the way, which is evoked at the end with this list of names, Dad and Rabab, Fertana and Hind, Lubna and Selma. These are all names that people would associate with beloveds of the ancient Arabic poetic tradition. It combines this remembrance of the lost beloved, the remembrance of the stations of the lost beloved and how she left the poet and went here and went there, with the stations of the Hajj pilgrimage and the actual rites, specific rites of the pilgrimage either the Hajj or the shorter one, the I'timar, which are both referenced in the poem. So El-Khatib, my understanding is it resonates back with the ancient Arabic Nasib, the remembrance of the lost beloved. Yalamlam could also, but Yalamlam is also a very important place in the Hajj ritual. It's one of the 4 miqats, where one of the 4 places where people coming from 4 different directions to the sacred territory of Mecca stop and take on the sacred clothes and the sacred, have their haircut, etc., their fingernails, etc., and then take on the sacred, the sanctity that is required to go into the Haram area, the most sacred area in Mecca. So you'll see and La'la'i is clearly one of the classical stations. I find it back in early tradition. So here you see the Yalamlam coming here in a seamless way. It doesn't call too much of attention to itself yet. And then there you'll find those you'd come to know, my fast is for them, my pilgrimage, my holy days. Now, it would have been too long to get in my major pilgrimage and my minor pilgrimage and etc. So I'll have to have a note. I'll have notes to each poem explaining that the 2 pilgrimages here are the Hajj and the I'timar, or the Umrah. Then Pebble Ground near Mina. So here's a place name, El Muhassab min Mina. So El Muhassab is a place near Mina where people hurriedly gather pebbles to later throw at these pillars or mounds of stones, probably before that, the 3 different ones in the famous rite of the Hajj. Oblations field, that would be the field where the great sacrifices carried out of Eid al-Adha. And of course, Zamzam is the sacred spring that was opened up for Ismail's mother and Ismail, when Ismail's mother was desperately seeking for water, running back and forth between 7 hills, known as Hagar in the biblical tradition, not mentioned by name in the Quran, but whose struggles are performed in the Hajj. So here's both a bringing of this movement in time and space and recollection and loss and memory into the actual Hajj ritual, and then taking the Hajj ritual and then interiorizing it in a very striking way, saying, their pebble ground, my heart, their offerings field, my soul, their sacred spring, that would be the equivalent of Zamzam, my blood. And then when they come to Hajj, so there's a medieval Arabic encyclopedia by Yaqut, and in the introduction to it, it's a geographical encyclopedia. It has all the place names of Arabia that he can find. In the introduction, he said, no one these days who writes anything will avoid evoking the stations of Zarud and Hajar. But then, strangely, he doesn't have an article on Hajar. So here we have this powerful lyric poetry with its extraordinary mystical implications, but then it's also tied in to a very compelling life story and a situation of trying to bring people, it brings us into the nitty-gritty, the spatial and temporal worlds of traveling to the Kaaba, along these pilgrimage stations in Arabia. Every aspect of those stations was known and recalled. And Hajar most likely was a station on the road, on the pilgrimage trail between Medina and Kufa, known as Zubaydah's Trail, because Zubaydah, the wife of Harun al-Rashid, had really fixed up the trail for pilgrims and had set up cisterns along the way where people could get enough water to go for a day. And there are only about 4 places where you could get enough water to let your camels drink and really fill your water supplies. So Hajar would be right there in Najd, and at the moment people would go from the lowland areas of the Hijaz, and sometimes called Tehama, up to the highland areas. Then there's this entire world of the fragrance of Najd, the scent of Najd, and the meaning of that scent of Najd passed on by the east wind. All right, here goes the second one. So I just put down some of the information here. Simone Fattal, Post Apollo Press, that's coming out, God willing, sometime. Cover art by Atel Adnan. There's the second one, the Lockard Poetry and Translation. That's in process. And that gave me the subtitle for this talk, Strung Out Between Najd and Tiham. So the reason I chose that subtitle is because a lot of Ibn Arabi's poetry is talking about the beloved might be in the highlands or in the lowlands. If she's in the highlands, his heart is there. If she's in the lowlands, the word for highland is Najd. The word for lowland is often Tiham. But there's a verb in Arabic to go to the highland, anjada, or to go to the lowland, athama. And so how do you bring across these word plays? And how many word plays can you bring across in a translation? So if the goal, as it is mine, is to make the translation read as poetry in English, occasionally challenge the reader with something that is unanswered, but not to bombard the reader with technical words and parentheses, etc. This is one of the fine lines that's constantly being walked. So Bewildered is, you could say, Tiham, and the Lockard series is Najd. And all the things in between include how to deal with Ibn Arabi's prefaces, how much of the commentary to translate, decisions on form, couplets, stanzas, how to transliterate. So I didn't use diacritical dots in the poetry part because most English readers will not know what a dot under an H means. But I do use that in the notes and the critical apparatus because this is meant for both Arabic speaker / readers and English speaker / readers. And you your one knowledge, the Arabic/readers, to understand what you're doing, to see what you're doing, and to know what Arabic word is being represented. And at the same time, you want to give your English reader a word that they can imagine pronouncing and hear mentally, even if they're not reading it out loud. And then that meant I used some simple accent aigus, accents, they're stress accents, just to indicate how we would pronounce the word in English, since we're not pronouncing it in Arabic precisely or with the Arabic kind of quantitative metrics. Now, the Reynolds-Nicholson volume of 1911, I think, is really one of the great works of scholarship of the early 20th century. And he has this introduction where it's like a little bit of adab, Oxfordian adab. He says, adab being a form of cultured speech, not being pretentious, not overselling one's case. He said, I had a friend who had a manuscript of this work by Ibn Arabi, and a couple of things attracted me to this project. One, it's short, and two, there was a manuscript there. Now, he also just happened to have selected a work of extraordinary importance. It was only the second print Arabic edition or printing in Europe. The other one being just a very small piece of Ibn Arabi's essay on technical terms. He translated it really very carefully. I think just having gone back over it for years and years and years. And his translation, it has all kinds of things that I wish we could use today, like saith. If you could say saith and goeth, all those things, your rhythm and your metrics would be so much easier. And English has given them up, but we don't have anything to substitute for, so it makes it a little harder. But people don't tend to read that kind of language anymore, and some of the younger generation is quite baffled by it. He used 3 manuscripts through the Ibn Arabi Society and the extraordinary efforts of the Ibn Arabi Society to gather these manuscripts from around the world in digital form. I was able to get access to 6 or 7 more, and the 2 of them are what Jane Clark and Stephen Hertenstein have called historic manuscripts. That means even though we do not have a holograph, that is a manuscript written out in toto in Ibn Arabi's own personal hand, and even though we don't have an autograph, which means that the manuscript was written down as part of a sama process, a hearing, a group of, we could call it a seminar, and then all the participants would sign at the end saying, I was here, and then Ibn Arabi would sign and say, I was here, I heard this read by so-and-so, and I testify that these are my words. We don't have either of those, but we have 2 really precious manuscripts. One of them is called Raghib Pasha. It's well done. It's vocalized all the way through, which means that all the vowels are put in, which is quite rare. It's written in a clear script. It has a copy of Ibn Arabi's testimony dated to around 617, in which he said, I was here when so-and-so, when this was read, and I authorized so-and-so to make a copy off of my own manuscript in connection with that. So that is what they call historic manuscript. We have hundreds of manuscripts from the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, but we only have a couple of these historic ones. Then we used, there's a fabulously careful edition by Ashwaq in Arabic, published, I think, in either Cairo or Syria, around 1995. He uses 5 manuscripts from Dar al-Kutub, all of the, around the 16th century, and a couple more from Aleppo. And then we have the whole question about, what do you do? Do you want to bother readers with notes that say, this manuscript gives a different reading here, this guy, my decision was absolutely not, under no consideration, because most of the readings are pretty much similar. Almost all of the differences are trivial. A lot of them are based on simply mistakes, dropping diacritical marks. There's 3 really important things that I found that I wanted to mention. One is that poems 51 and 53 are not existing in most of the manuscripts we have, and that in the precious Ragib Pasha, they're numbered in a strange way and put at the very end of the manuscript. 2, the second poem, the order of verses that Nicholson used is a little puzzling. It's always been problematic for me as translator. I use that in Stations of Desire. What I find is almost all of the manuscripts have a different order where they have a different final verse that really brings poem 2 together. And the third one is that the famous poem that includes My Heart Became Capable of Every Form, 2 verses are not in any of the manuscripts, the older manuscripts. Those 2 verses, after the poet says, hour by hour they circle my heart and touch my corners with a kiss. Clearly the poet's voice now having become the Kaaba. Then there's 2 verses that say, as the best of creation, that is the Prophet Muhammad, circled the Kaaba, even though reason with its proofs would call that unworthy. And he was a Nautic, the one who, he had the voice, spoke the word. And what is a building of stone compared to a human being? Those 2 verses are not in any of the old manuscripts. So in Bewildered, I put them in parentheses, and in the new version, I'm going to have them in a note explaining that. How are we doing time-wise, oh sages?
It's 1 o'clock, but we can run a little bit longer because it's sound, it's not a hot meal. But
So
not another 10 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
5-10 minutes?
I'll wrap up, and if you'll give me a 5 when I'm at 5. All right? There are other Tarjumans. So when one says you're going to translate the Tarjuman, the first question is, great, which Tarjuman? So there's the Tarjuman, which are the poems by themselves. There's the Tarjuman with the preface of the lady at the Kaaba. There's another Tarjuman with the famous preface of Nizam, the young woman that Ibn Arabi dedicates the poems to, that he meets when he first comes to Mecca, who's the daughter of a famous scholar and the niece of a famous scholar, his sister from Isfahan. She represents, throughout the volume, the quintessence of Persia, the quintessence of the Ajam, those who do not speak Arabic. And there's this kind of love affair between opposites going throughout the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, between the East and the West being the Arab, the East being the Persian. How can the two ever meet? And kind of a triumph over that logic of mutual contradiction. So and then there's the commentary. And the commentary starts out, as some of you may know, by friends of Ibn Arabi, dear friends, saying, oh, some people in Aleppo are criticizing your verses. They say something you said about them really being about all the subtleties of ma'arif, of knowings, or gnosis, that you just said that because you like to write ghazal and nasib, love poetry, and you're a big sheikh, so you wanted to explain it away. So then Ibn Arabi says, so at their urging, I wrote this commentary. So here we have two opposite complaints. The lady at the Kaaba says, you don't know what real love is because your love is not passionate enough. And then this sheikh says, you're getting too far into this love stuff. You're supposed to be talking about abstruse theological matters. So there's a lot of different Tarjuman al-Ashwaqs. And when we translate the poems, how do we take all that into consideration? The commentary is extraordinarily rich. It can often tell us, what kind of word the poet had in mind. My own theory is that Ibn Arabi says throughout that commentary, throughout these other works, Muhadarat al-Abrar, which is an astonishing work by Ibn Arabi that includes 40 of these poems, hundreds of other poems, stories, hadith, etc., and this amazing new work that's been shown by Julian Cook, Stephen Hertenstein, Claude Adas, and others to likely include a large amount of Ibn Arabi's poetry that was not in the Diwan that was published in Egypt. And in it, he constantly uses the phrase before each set of verses, this was the occasion, this was the spirit, the movement of the spirit, and this was the hearing, as sama. So my sense of that work is that every poem comes out of a specific occasion, a specific dynamic factor, and that when Ibn Arabi comments on his own poems, which he does not only in the commentary but throughout these other works, he's often commenting upon the particular moment, occasion, spirit that is upon him at the moment. There's one wonderful point where he says about the word arwah in the poem that Stefan Spril is going to talk to us about, that the arwah rustled in the trees and passed me away, that this word can be the plural of ruh, spirit, or the plural of ri, wind. And he says the poet meant winds. If he had meant spirits, a poet meant spirits. If he had meant winds, this is what he would have meant. Now, maybe that's his moment at the moment he's commenting, but if he knows what he would have meant if he meant the other, it makes the whole issue of this moment and how to take commentaries very interesting. 5. So in the process of translating, I ended up reading Muhadarat al-Abrar because I'm using those 40 poems as part of the like manuscripts, another version, another way that Ibn Arabi testifies to those poems, and the same with Diwan al-Ma'arif. In Muhadarat al-Abrar, I found what I think is a clue to the question that's long puzzled me, which is, where did this kind of poetry at the beginning of the 13th century Common Era that Ibn al-Farid, Ibn al-Arabi, and another poet known as Shustari, some call him the Rumi of North Africa, where did this kind of poetry that mixes nasib and longing with Hajj, and longing for the Hajj, longing to be back at the Hajj, remembering every moment at the Hajj, where did it come from? And people have speculated that, but there has never been, to my knowledge, anything. What I found was that Muhadarat al-Abrar, the two most cited poets are Mihyar Daylami and Sharif Aradi. They were both Shiites. They both lived in Baghdad. They both had positions as Naqib of the Hajj. They led Hajj pilgrimages. Their poetry, much of their poetry is steeped in the Hajj. And Sharif al-Radi has a collection which has been put together called Hijaziyat, which are this kind of poetry without the different kind of moods and voices of Ibn Arabi about the Hajj, longing for the Hajj, longing for each station of the Hajj, the stations of the Hajj being the stations of the beloved, etc. And one step back further, Ibn Jawzi, also from Baghdad, a Hanbali scholar, has a book on the Hajj called a Taghreed, which sets out to inflame people's passion for going on the Hajj. And it's filled with this kind of poetry. And many of the poems in there are the ones that Ibn Arabi cites from the Hijaziyat and others. So one of the senses is that these poems don't come out of anywhere. They're steeped in a classical tradition. Of course, they brilliantly resonate with Ibn Arabi's mystical philosophy, but they don't announce it directly very often in the poems. And my conclusion is there's a reason that many poets did not announce that directly in the poems, and it has to do with the fact that their sense is that Shawq, this almost infinite longing, is a cosmic force. Henri Corbin wrote about it as the cosmological force that created the universe and brings all back to its creator. That this cosmic longing, if one starts to divide it up between sacred and profane, between was he really with a woman there, or a man, or is this all a symbol? Then it loses its sense that Shawq cannot be divided up into simple categories of above and below, transcendent and in the world. So thank you all for this talk, and thank you for my 10-minute dispensation.